Don't settle for bad socks. Get comfort and grip at an affordable price with Pure Grip Socks Pro. Choose from 18 different colors at puregripsocks.com.
There's absolutely no denying that the Skechers SKX01 in more ways than one is a direct copy of the now discontinued Nike Phantom GT, but which one is actually better? The answer to that question might surprise you. And really quickly, before we get started, consider subscribing if you haven't already to stay up to date with the latest in football boots. When it comes to price, despite the SKX coming out last year and the Phantom GT releasing in 2018, obviously with inflation and everything, I know these are Skechers, but you'd probably expect something to come out 5 years later to cost more money, but that's not actually the case. The Phantom GT in low cut form retailed for $250, where in mid-cut form, basically just adding a collar, it would cost you an extra $25 at $275. Where the current SKX, either in low cut form like I have here, or in mid-cut form, because they do offer that option, retails for $225. It's obviously not the most relevant thing to compare given that the Phantom GTs are now discontinued, but it's interesting nonetheless. When it comes to the design, features, general performance, and even just the feel of these two uppers, there genuinely is not a lot that separates the two. With the Phantom GT upper being a Flyknit base material that is extremely thin and admittedly doesn't really have a soft sock-like quality. It's decently pliable, but in general feels more like a synthetic rather than a sock, which I think is what a lot of people expect when they hear Flyknit. And then of course GT, which stands for generative texture, is what covers pretty much the entirety of the upper, where you can see a bunch of these little lines varying in length as well as angle and position flowing throughout the entire upper, where, as I've talked about in past videos, it's very interesting how Nike touted that every single line was strategically positioned for the sake of control and touch on the ball, but then they just slap a Nike swoosh right in the middle with a generic texture. So how much is that actually enhancing performance? In my opinion, very little. All it's really doing is giving the surface of the upper a gritty texture to the touch, but on the ball, the additional grip that you actually get is fairly minimal, and from a performance standpoint, in terms of how it modifies the feel of the football boot, it's one of those features that, in my opinion, doesn't do much of anything. Where the upper of the SKX feels and looks pretty well identical. It too is a thin knit-based material, but it ends up feeling more like a thin synthetic rather than a sock-like boot, just given that it's lacking in padding as well as overall softness. And then on the surface, you're going to find little lines running throughout, giving this boot kind of an abrasive, rough texture on the surface. You have these kind of flowing ridges as well that adds a little bit more texture to the surface. But just like the Phantom GT, its overall effect in terms of touch on the ball is very minimal in terms of actually giving you any meaningful extra grip. It feels fine, don't get me wrong, the same can be said about the Phantom GT, but in terms of how this impacts the feel of these football boots, again, micro texture has been done before, it will continue to be done, it will always be promoted as this major feature on any given football boot that features it, but in terms of its actual impact, it's just not significant enough to do anything on either boot. If you like a thinner feeling upper that's not overly slick on the ball, both of these do a great job of that. When it comes to the sole plates and stud patterns on these two boots, again, the similarities are pretty undeniable, and it's not that they're technically different and not that the Phantom GT design was overly unique to begin with. This is pretty much a recycled variation of something that you'd expect to find on a Nike Mercurial, but what Skechers have done is effectively mirrored the same overall design. They moved this kind of support structure bar connecting the forefoot and the heel plate from the lateral side kind of more towards the middle on a little bit more of an extreme angle. And in terms of the shape and positioning of the studs, they're obviously all slightly different, but the only real noticeable difference is the addition of this stud right here on the forefoot that you won't find on the Phantom GT. In terms of the feel of the sole plate as well as the traction performance from these two stud patterns though, there's pretty much no difference. While it's not something you would typically think to compare, the insoles on these two boots I think are particularly interesting. Where the Phantom GT features what is a pretty standard Nike insole. You have this mesh liner on the surface, nothing crazy about that. It's made from a single layer of this yellow foam, and then it has this firmer white foam insert in the midfoot with a very specific pattern that actually matches the pattern you'll find on the underside of the insole to kind of help it clip in place and not be able to slide around inside of the boot. It's something that I think is a really clever idea. Where the insoles of the SKX also feature that mesh liner on the surface, nothing unique about that. The foam itself is a little bit thicker than the Nikes, and it's actually their Hyper Burst Pro material that feels really soft. This, I would say, is one of the nicer insoles you're going to find in football boots as of right now. It provides a nice underfoot cushion that most boots will not provide. The interesting part, however, is this insert in the middle where you can clearly see there's a slightly different type of foam. And there's also a pattern in that foam that if you look inside the SKX, it doesn't actually match that pattern at all. Effectively meaning that Skechers saw the insert on the Phantom GT insole, and we have to keep in mind that there is a team of ex-Nike employees that were working on the SKX, but nonetheless, they saw this insert, put it on their insole, but didn't go as far to actually make the insert meaningful to the actual performance. It's a feature they inserted for the sake of copying rather than preventing the insole from sliding around, which is the actual point of the insert, at least on the Nike boots. And then there's the weight. Which one is lighter? The scale, of course, does not lie. Both in the same size, 9.5 US. We'll start off with the Phantom GTs. They weigh in at 7.5 ounces, the equivalent of 213 grams. Change the scale back to ounces, and we'll throw on the Skechers SKX01. They weigh in at 8.5 ounces, the equivalent of 240 grams. That's a difference of a full ounce or just over 25 grams in favor of the Nikes, which definitely do feel like the lighter football boots, but do I think the extra ounce is detrimental to the performance of the SKX? Definitely not. With the thicker, more cushioned insole alone accounting for a lot of the extra weight. When it comes to the fit and feel on feet, the difference isn't huge, but I think the differences are significant in that I do have a preference of one over the other. Like I said, the feel of the upper, both in hand as well as on feet, is pretty well the same. They're knit bases, but they do have a little bit more of that kind of firmer, thin synthetic. I don't want to say rigid, but it's definitely stiffer than what you would expect to get from something that is labeled as a knitted upper. One of the major differences is going to be the lacing system, where of course on the Phantom GT, it's a little bit shallower and it's slightly offset, where on the SKX01, it's pretty much straight down the middle. And I think that straight down the middle lacing system, along with a slightly different shape that's a little bit wider with a little bit more volume pretty much all the way through, makes for what I would argue is a better fitting football boot. Also one that is more comfortable, at least for my feet. Of course, the shape of your feet specifically will very much depend on which one of these two you might find a little bit more comfortable, or at the very least, which one's going to fit you better. Through the heel, very similar. Through the toes, definitely more of a pinch, narrower feel in the Phantom GT compared to the Skechers alternative. And like I talked about earlier in the video, I think the insoles on the SKX01 are just better overall. It has a little bit more of that softer kind of cushion feel underfoot, where the Phantom GT is like most other boots, where there's just not much in the way of cushion at all. Flexibility of the sole plate is pretty much the same. From a width perspective, like I mentioned, the Skechers is definitely wider. Not to the point where I would say they are the best option for somebody with super wide feet, just because of that one-piece upper. It's not super stretchy, but once you get your feet inside of the boots, definitely it is the wider option, and it should work well for most foot types. And then as far as sizing is concerned, I'm wearing both of these boots in my usual size 9.5 US, and the fit and the length is pretty much the same. So regardless of which one you decide to go for, if you're after a pair of now discontinued Phantom GTs, going true to size is definitely the way to go. But again, in terms of fit and comfort between these two, I prefer the Skechers. So in conclusion, while I don't think there's really anything about the Phantom GT as a concept that's particularly original, there is no denying that Skechers with the SKX01 have effectively copied almost every single element of this football boot in one way or another, which in general is not something that I really approve of, and it's something that for me irks me about the Skechers brand. We see it a lot in their kind of more casual wear footwear, and I know they're trying to establish themselves as a little bit more of a serious performance brand, but doing it this way probably wasn't the best move. I get it, it's hard to do something completely new and innovative in the world of football boots at this point, but straight up copying another design, discontinued or not, is not the way to go about things. With all of that said, if we're purely basing this comparison on fit, feel, comfort, as well as overall performance, given the choice between these two football boots, I think the Skechers SKX01 is actually the better Phantom GT, which is sad to say, but it's the truth.